Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture in this series on the medieval Armenian historical tradition. I just want to say before starting that it's been a real pleasure to share this time together with you over the course of the last 2 semesters, and I'm especially grateful to those of you who've been consistently present from week to week. It's been a source of great encouragement to me as I've prepared these, which in many ways, these lectures have been as challenging as they've been intellectually stimulating, especially in the second half, where a lot of the material was not as familiar to me. So, last time, we spent some time with a few historians from the 13th to 15th centuries. We looked at Grigor of Agner, Stephanos Orbelian, and Tovma of Medzop, all of whom lived through times marked by insecurity, uncertainty, calamity, and destruction brought about by foreign invasions and unstable political conditions. We focused on the way in which each responded to these crises by turning to their Christian, especially monastic tradition, to offer spiritual consolation and hope to their readers. We ended last week's lecture by looking at the final words of Tovma of Medzop's history, traditionally considered last in the medieval historical tradition, who prays for judgment to come upon the oppressors of the Armenians and blessing upon the Armenian people through the intercession of the new martyrs of the faith. It's a somewhat bleak but not totally hopeless end to a great tradition of writing, spanning some 1,000 years. Of course, time is a fluid thing, and historical periodization and chronological labels, like ancient, late antique, medieval, and modern, are somewhat arbitrary constructions made by contemporary historians to help us to break down the past into units that we can conceptualize and understand. Tovma, of course, was not conscious of the fact that he would later be considered the last in the line of medieval historians, nor were those chroniclers and historians who picked up the pen after him necessarily conscious of the fact that they were writing in what would be defined as a new era. So today, as a way of concluding this lecture series, I would like to look past Tovma of Medzop and into the era that is called the early modern. So I've titled this final lecture, Historiography in the Early Modern World and Beyond. Arakel of Tabriz, Simeon of Poland, and Mikayel Chamchean. We'll spend most of our time with the first two. Arakel of Tabriz and Simeon of Poland. These two texts, both coming from the 17th century, provide a glimpse into some of the most salient and significant features of this fascinating period and its texts. They were both contemporaries, but they lived on opposite ends of the Armenian world, which will give us an interesting comparison. But before we delve into these writers and their texts, let's ask what characterizes the early modern period and early modern Armenian history in particular. And in what follows, I'm basically just going to summarize some of what I've learned from studying with historian Sebu Aswanian during my PhD at UCLA. Professor Aswanian is basically the leading contemporary scholar in defining and studying this period as it pertains to Armenian history. So in general terms, the early modern period is understood as the years between 1500 and 1800. And one of the defining features of this period is increased mobility on a massive and global scale. As historian Timothy Brooke writes about the 17th century in particular, more people were in motion over longer distances and sojourning away from home for longer periods of time than at any other time in human history. What facilitated much of this movement was the opening of global sea passages that led to the discovery, first of all, of the New World, and brought about the connectivity of cultures across continents, and thus the creation of a global economy that owed much to the seafaring merchants who peddled their goods from one part of the globe to the other. The period is also marked by demographic fluctuations, so the movement of peoples, the growth of world population, the expansion of imperial states, and technological innovations and diffusions, such as the introduction of printing, which led to a revolution in information exchange. Well, we've talked a lot in this series about calamity and crisis, noting how with each crisis, in addition to the chaos it brings, also bears with it the promise of new opportunity and a new beginning. The early modern period begins for Armenians with a great crisis. Two, in fact. Cilicia, the last Armenian kingdom, has long since fallen, and in the 16th century, historic Armenia was the frontier zone between the Ottoman and Safavid empires, which throughout the 1500s engaged in near constant warfare, much to the detriment of those who lived in these regions. And here on the map, you can see this territory, essentially historic Armenia, and this was basically the frontier zone or borderlands between the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Safavid Persian Empire to the east and south. And all the colors that are kind of like stripes with two colors in each section, you see how like that's a majority of what's on the screen. Those are basically territories that shifted back and forth between the Ottomans and the Persians. And essentially war was intermittent but ongoing for pretty much the entire 16th century and the first half of the 17th. So capping off this miserable century for those who were unfortunate enough to live here, and marking the beginning of the next were two calamitous events that led to the migration of many Armenians out of their traditional homeland in Eastern Anatolia, something that by now has become thematic in this period. The first crisis was what's known as the Jalali rebellions, or uprisings, which lasted for 3 decades from 1590 to 1620. So who were the Jalali? Well, the Jalali were companies of outlaws or brigands that were led by disgruntled Ottoman army officers who organized themselves into unstoppable groups that lived off of pillage and plunder, essentially terrorizing the land and its inhabitants and reigning unchecked by Ottoman authorities. Many local Armenians, already exhausted from decades of warfare, found the conditions created by the Jalalis to be unbearable, and so fled westwards to Constantinople, Izmir, and their environs, as well as the Black Sea coast, Crimea, Poland, and elsewhere. And here you can see a map of some of the Armenian settlements that were established along the Black Sea coast, Crimea, etc. And so this led to significant population increases of Armenians in these areas, especially in and around Constantinople, which soon became the center of the Western Armenian diaspora and led to the prominence of the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople. Next, as part of a military strategy to depopulate the frontier zone and create a protective no man's land that would make invasion difficult, the Safavid Persian Shah Abbas relocated several 100,000 Armenians from their homelands in various cities and villages that made up the borderlands between the Ottoman and Safavid empires. Notable among these places was the prosperous city of Julfa, known already in the 16th century for its wealthy and prosperous Armenian merchants. Shah Abbas settled these Armenians in various territories of his empire, most notably into a suburb of his capital at Isfahan, which became known as New Julfa. And here on the map, right in the center, you can see Isfahan. Right here. And you can see in small letters here, Nor Julfa. This is where the Armenians were concentrated. And here was Old Julfa up here. So it's essentially Armenians in this region that were relocated southwards and eastwards into the Safavid Empire. So New Julfa became the home city of a large merchant network that over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries would soon expand to most of the port cities of the early modern world, from Amsterdam, London, and Marseille in the west to Calcutta, Madras, and Jakarta in the east. This global merchant network has been the subject of a number of studies by Sebu Aswanian, especially his first book, From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, the Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants. And if anyone's interested in this topic, I'd highly recommend that book. By means of their business ventures, the Julfan Armenians became rich and prosperous, and like the Nakharar noble class of previous eras, became the sponsors of cultural production, including manuscripts, printed books, church building, etc. The two historians we'll look at tonight lived in the 17th century, and their texts and lives bear witness to some of the trends that mark the globalized experience of many Armenians in the early modern world. So the first we'll look at is Arakel of Tabriz, who most considered to be the most important historian of the 17th century. So Tabriz is located right here on the map. So again, it's part of the Safavid Persian Empire, but essentially in very close to Armenia. So let's look at the text. So you can see on the right is the English edition, published in 2005, 2006 in 2 volumes. And it was published, or was translated by George Bournoutian, who recently passed away, a great scholar of this period. And he made a major focus of his scholarly activity the translation and study of texts relating to Eastern Armenia and Persia between the 14th to the end of the 19th centuries. So essentially this whole period. And there's at least like 10 or so such primary texts that he translated and published. And it's, really excellent work he did and a great help to scholars. And so this history of Arakel was commissioned in 1651 by the Catholicos of the time, Pilibos of Arbak. He halted it at the Catholicos' death, then continued when the next Catholicos commissioned him, Hagop of Julfa. It was finally completed in 1662, near the end of Arakel's life. And interestingly, it was printed in 1669 by Voskan Yerevansi, who was the publisher, some of you may know, of the very first Armenian Bible printed in Amsterdam. And so it's interesting that in this period, Arakel's text went from, being handwritten to almost immediately published. And this is one of the first instances of a writer who wrote a book among Armenians and had it distributed via publication as opposed to manuscript copies. So Arakel was from Tabriz, spent most of his life in Echmiadzin, where he was educated as a pupil of the Catholicos Pilibos, and he received the rank of Vartabed in the 1630s. He was sent by the Catholicos as a Nevirak. Not sure if you've heard this term before, but it's essentially an emissary that's sent from Etchmiadzin or one of the other patriarchates to various Armenian communities around the world in order to collect dues and gifts for the Holy See. So you'd be sent around to all these different merchant communities or these various cities, and you would collect money or gifts for the church. And this was very common in this period. So by doing that, he visited numerous Armenian communities, including Amasya, Sebastia, Urfa or Edessa, Aleppo, Jerusalem, Athens, and Isfahan. And it's during that time of traveling that he collected a lot of the information for his history. He gathered stories, observed life, and examined colophons in various manuscripts kept in the towns and villages of Eastern and Western Armenia. So his history covers the years 1602 to 1662. So this includes the period of intense fighting between the Ottoman and Safavid empires, the Jalali rebellions and raids, and the deportations of Shah Abbas, especially at Julfa, but also other places. So I thought we could read together his description of the deportation of Julfa. And let's remember here that this is essentially the origin of the Eastern Armenian diaspora or the Persian Armenian Barskahai community, which essentially owes its existence to this, calamitous beginning. So it's the 5th chapter of the 1st volume. So he says, "It is now time to tell about the large and glorious town of Julfa. The Shah Abbas now summoned this Tamas Koli, one of his officials, to his presence, wrote a nomos, Greek word if you recognize it, that is a decree, gave it to him, and ordered him to go to Julfa to expel its entire population, and to leave not a single inhabitant there. Tamas Koli left the Shah, rushed straight to Julfa, summoned its notables, and with great fury threatened them with harsh and torturous death if they did not immediately carry out the Shah's order. They assembled all the people and read the Shah's decree, in which it was written, 'His Majesty orders you, the inhabitants of Julfa, to leave your homes and to go to the land of the Persians.' After that, Tamas Koli ordered the Jarchi, that is, the town crier, to announce the following in every quarter of the town of Julfa. 'The great King Shah Abbas orders you to leave and move to the land of the Persians. If you move within 3 days, we shall treat you leniently. Those who are found here after 3 days will be killed, and their families and their belongings will become captives. If anyone flees or hides, his property shall be given to the person who points him out, and his head will be sent to the Shah.' The town crier shouted this order everywhere and scared everyone. The Julfans, fearing death, did not linger at all. The Shah's order was immediately carried out, and they went on their way. But since they had to leave in a hurry and could not make advanced preparations, people could not find beasts of burden. They were anxious, for although all their belongings were scattered in front of them, they could not load and take anything because of the lack of oxen. Those who managed to take items took only some. Those who did not buried them in hiding places and dugouts. Most of their belongings were lost and plundered." And he goes on to describe, how terribly difficult it was to transport, how many people died crossing the river, and people had their goods stolen, etc. And there's a moving passage where they say goodbye to their church that was there. And I thought we could read that too. He says, the priest took the keys to the church called Upper Katan, went out by the gate of the town of Julfa, and made their way to the church called Astvadzadzin, Mother of God, built outside the walls of Julfa. They stopped and looked at the church. Many of the Christians who had also brought the keys to their houses came and joined the priest, and all together they let out a mournful wail. With their hearts breaking to pieces and their eyes full of tears, they moaned and cried and loudly called on the Mother of God, saying, O Holy Mother of God, we entrust to you the keys of our holy church and our houses. Bring us back from the foreign land where they are taking us. After making this prayer, they threw the keys in the river. They cried and wailed continuously for many hours, and they then continued on their way. And so you can imagine back then how uncertain the situation was for these Julfins. You know, they're leaving home, the place they've lived, and, you know, their families have lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and going to a place they don't know what it's going to be. But Arakel, of course, is writing from the 1650s and 1660s when the Julfin community has already been established in Isfahan and is flourishing thanks to their sponsorship by the Shah, who really just wanted to facilitate their great merchant activity and benefit in his own way from the exceptional trade activity of the Julfin merchants. And so now we get a glimpse into how it was that the situation became so good for these people who were moved to New Julfa. So he says, they settled them there at Isfahan and provided them with land parcels for construction. The Julfins built their homes and living quarters with magnificent structures, vaulted trade arcades, pavilions with extensions, summer houses, high living quarters decorated with beautiful golden and azure colors. They also built marvelously decorated churches, worthy of God's glory, with heaven-like chapels and sublime cupolas, enriched with many colors, with gold and azure, depicting the mysteries of the Lord and the images of the saints. On top of the cupola of each church stood the Holy Cross, the symbol of the eternal church and the pride of every Christian. And now he goes into why it was that they were able to prosper so much. And it's essentially because the Shah gave them privileged treatment, as you can see here. There were many reasons why the inhabitants of Julfa and other Armenians were settled in the city of Isfahan. The king, Shah Abbas, being a sober and clever administrator, sought ways to keep the Armenians in the land of Persia, for without his effort, they would not stay there. First of all, Shah Abbas was a friend of the Armenians and respected them, especially the Julfins. He personally and constantly visited their homes and drank and ate their food without hesitation, for it's customary among the Persians to be squeamish with Christians, considering them unclean. He also invited them to his home and his table and honored them as his own notables. He also ordered his grandees to behave in the same manner. Second, at the request of the Christians, he relieved the poll tax paid by the Christians to the royal treasury. Third, if there were any arguments or litigations between Christians and Muslims, major or minor, he vindicated the Christians and condemned the Muslims. Fourth, when he drove the Christians out of Armenia and settled them in Isfahan and the surrounding villages, many Muslims were evicted from their homes, like in order to make room for the Christians to live. Their houses and fields were given to the Christians. Fifth, he on his own volition ordered the construction of churches all over New Julfa and its environs, and inside the walls of Isfahan, a grand and tall church. He favored the Christians and personally ordered them to build churches. During the major holidays, Easter, Ascension, and others, he came to church and celebrated together with the Christians. Six, the Christians openly observed all their religious traditions and rituals, banged jangles, called people to prayer, and observed with great ceremony the Feast of Theophany. So all those kind of things they were unable to do especially under in the Ottoman Empire, they're able to do here and have not just the Shah's sponsorship, but even his like participation in some of the things. And so it's just a great example of the kind of the fact that not every crisis, or calamity is the end of the world. Here's an example where at the beginning, it looks like it's going to be terrible and be the end of life as you know it. But within just a generation, the Julfans who settled in New Julfa were able to create a life and amass wealth and build things that were even better, far, far better than they had before they came. And let's take a look at just one of those churches that they built. The most famous one, Surp Amena Purgic Vank, so All Saviors Monastery. So this is what it looks like on the outside. You'd almost think it was a mosque if you just glanced at it, until maybe you notice the crosses on the top of the cupolas. And, it looks very kind of simple and austere, kind of just like a mosque would be. You can see the date on the front, 1606, built, just after the Julfans arrived here, but construction went on for a time. And then if you enter inside, it looks like this. So absolutely, decked out in gold and colors and images. A testament, of course, to how wealthy this community was. Here's one of the domes. So absolutely stunning. So the next text that we'll look at is called the Travel Accounts of Simeon of Poland. And so with this text, we get the introduction of an exciting new genre that made its appearance in the early modern world, the travel account. So in Armenian, this text was called Urekrutyun. So it's actually very interesting, the history of this text. So it was handwritten, manuscript by Simeon in the mid 1600s. And then it doesn't seem to have ever really circulated or been published. And in the early 20th century, the great Makhitara scholar, Nersess, he was traveling and went to the University of Lvov in Poland. And he discovered this manuscript, and he realized, it's this very interesting travel account, and he published it successively in the Handa Samsoria, the literary journal or academic journal of the Vienna Mekhitarist order. And then it was first published as a book for the first time in 1936. And since then, it's attracted a lot of interest, especially after the translation and study by George Bournoutian in 2007, who translated it into English and then consequently brought it to the attention of many more people. So it's Simeon Lehats, which indicates that he's from Poland. And so if you remember this map I showed, you can see up on, the bottom left here, you have the Armenian community that made its way to Poland. So Armenian communities had already been immigrating to this larger area since after the fall of Ani in the 11th century. There were more migrations after the Mongol invasions and after the fall of Cilicia. And the major concentration was in Lvov, right here. And also this Kamenets Podolsk, right here. And so most of this community was merchants and artisans who ended up doing very well for themselves. And many more Armenians immigrated here in the 15th and 16th centuries, or in 17th century, after the Jalali rebellions. And by the 17th century, there were about 30 different Armenian settlements just in Western Ukraine and Poland. And as I mentioned, Lvov was kind of the capital or center of the Polish Armenian community. So Simeon was born in 1584. So he's a near contemporary of Arakel. And he was educated by clerics. He began a kind of clerical education, but he remained a tabir. He didn't go beyond that. He was very interested in books and manuscripts. He spent a lot of time in his youth mastering book and manuscript arts and developed just a passion for collecting and reading religious and historical books. And he would later use those skills to earn his living as a scribe, both during his travels to Constantinople and Jerusalem, and then also when he returned home later. And let's read the introduction to his work to hear him talk about himself and the reason for writing this text. So this is his introduction. He says, I, Simeon, son of Mardiros, am an unworthy man, a sinner, full of transgressions. Wicked and sinful slave, I am at the will of the Lord my God. I am also the lowest and most pitiful among all, the clergy, because he's a tabir, which is the fourth ecclesiastic rank, but I'm unworthy even of that. My parents were born in the coastal city of Kaffa, in the land of the Huns, which is guarded and watched over by God. They left that region and settled in a Christian land in the newly built town of Zamosts, in the land of the Rus, which is presently ruled by Poles. By Rus, he means Ukrainians in this context. They left us with strangers and went to the other world, to Christ, who is the salvation of everyone. However, they had sent me to study books, which I continued to do from childhood until maturity, studying them in learning institutions at the feet of Vartabeds and learned men. When I read the lives of the fathers of the church and the narratives of historians, my heart was filled, from then on and through the years to come, with inspiration and passionate love. For it is written, my heart flamed within me, and a fire burned in my mind. That is why my heart constantly yearned and my body longed to travel, to visit the fabulous unknown provinces and the lands of the non-Christians, as well as to go on a pilgrimage, first to Holy Jerusalem, to the city where the Lord's footsteps tread, to worship at the radiant tomb of Christ and the other holy places. So here's Simeon. He's an orphan, essentially. He's sent to get this religious education. He falls in love with all these works he reads, and he's living in essentially Poland, far away, not just from the Armenian traditional homeland that he's reading about in all these works, but also the traditional kind of holy places of Jerusalem or, some of these major places. And so he's reading all this stuff, he's consumed with it, and he wants, let me go and visit and see these places with my own eyes. And it's in this time period where you can actually do that. There's traveling caravans going around, and he realized he could actually go and see these places for himself. So he desired to go see the holy places, Jerusalem, and from there to go to Mush, where the relics of St. John the Baptist were located. This is Surk Garabed in Mush, which was the most famous and popular pilgrimage site in Western Armenia. I'll say a little bit more about it later because we're going to read that section. Then travel to the great city of Rome, to the holy tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul, and to the numerous other tombs of the holy martyrs who shed so much blood for Christ. Therefore, sighing, I constantly prayed to the all-giving God, who dispenses all that is good and grants all wishes, to pay heed to my prayers and my good intentions, to grant me my heart's desire, and to show me the road by which I could reach the spiritual and divine goal. Beneficent, merciful, and loving God, who according to the Apostle James gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, he who grants the wishes of everyone, even more than we ask for or are aware of, and through who his most holy lips said, if you ask anything of the Father in my name, he will give it to you. As well as, for everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and so forth. He heard my plea. The Lord, the protector of the disparaged, he who does not abhor sinners, did not take into account my iniquity and my numerous other sins. He heard my prayers and granted my wish. He led me by the straight path according to his true promise. So Simeon set off in 1608 at the age of 24 to visit Armenian communities and holy places all around Europe and the Ottoman Empire. So he didn't travel alone by himself. That would have been too dangerous. But he traveled in a group by caravan. And his traveling companions were often either merchants or high-ranking clerics and legates of the Catholicoi of Cilicia and Etchmiadzin, or the patriarchs of Constantinople and Jerusalem, who would go around to various Armenian communities to check on them, minister to them, collect dues, etc. So his book is essentially a travel account or pilgrimage account and contains very valuable information on holy sites, as well as on Armenian and other communities in the many cities and villages that he visited, such as Constantinople and all the places around it, as you can see on the left. He also went to Rome, Venice, and other places in Europe. Then he went inland to Western Armenia to visit St. Gaudabat and Mush, and along the way stopped in many villages in Western Armenia, such as Diyarbakir, Kharpet, Tokat, Kayseri, Malatya, and Sebastia, and others that you see on the screen. He also visited Alexandria, Cairo, Jerusalem, and various other cities in Syria and Cilicia. And in addition to describing, the religious buildings and things he sees, he also describes the Armenian communities there. He describes Coptic, Syriac, Jewish, and Muslim communities. And it makes for very fascinating reading and is of much interest to historians who study this period. Because he also describes tolls, for traveling, what the terrain was like, the different travel routes, and other details about travel during that time. And as I mentioned, to fund his pilgrimage and sightseeing, he would often copy manuscripts or do other clerical work to kind of earn his keep and make a little extra income. And so let's see an example where he talks about that kind of work that he would do. So this example is drawn from his time in Jerusalem, where he ended up staying at St. Hagop's Monastery and doing work for the Patriarch of Jerusalem for a little bit. So he says, one day Rugas, this was his traveling partner on that part of his voyage, took me to the Patriarch of Jerusalem. I fell to his feet and gave him the donation for my prayers. He took the money, blessed me, and said, you have to give more, for you are from Poland. So Polish Armenians were very well off at that time. And so he's expecting, oh, here's some Polish Armenian, he must be a merchant or, some wealthy businessman who's making, his pilgrimage here to Jerusalem. And what's he doing giving me 2 pennies, or whatever it was that Simeon could afford. He says, Bishop Lugas is satisfied with you. You've performed many services for Jerusalem. I replied, I left Poland a long time ago. I'm an orphan and the son of poor parents. Accept this little amount, which I have earned by the labor of my hands. He ordered them to give me a separate room and said, as long as you are here, you shall be fed from my table and shall write whatever I order you to do. I kissed his right hand and left. He sent me paper and ink, and I began to write official circulars. These are gondoks that would be sent out to various communities. He dispatched niviraks, so those emissaries, to all countries, orders to churches, religious heads, khojas, merchants, and avakierets, or chief priests. And so Simeon would do the actual writing of these circulars that would be sent out. Meanwhile, Bishop Lugos filled my room with all sorts of blessings, delectable foods, and various gifts. He comforted me and showered me with kindness. In fact, the entire brotherhood of the monastery loved and honored me above the norm, for I had not earned it. May the Lord reward them. I stayed there from the day of the feast of the Holy Cross of Arak until Armenian Easter, so something like September to April, May. I copied books and together with the other deacons served in the church. So there's a lot of very interesting little snippets like this in the work. And let's just take one example of his, travel account. And I picked this part where he's traveling through Harput and describing the life there. So he says, from there, meaning from Malatya, after 3 days, we reached Harput, which is situated on a high mountain. There were 3 Armenian churches and 100 Armenian households. He always gives this information about the place he lived, how many people were there. So he says, the Muslims here are very evil, stupid, and hard-hearted, especially the Janissaries, for they rule the city and have constructed large homes resembling palaces. Each one acts like a master. There is a great deal of injustice, but no one dares say anything. And he's not just saying that, because they're Muslims. Like, for example, in the previous one, when he was in Malatya, he talks about how great the Muslims are there and how well the Armenians get along with them. So he says, that's why few Armenians remain here. The church of St. Hagop is so grand that even Muslims tremble before its magnificence, honor it, and offer gifts. In the city and in its surrounding villages live many Syrians. Inside the fortress, there was an ancient and large Syrian church. They say that it was constructed before the fortress. There was a large plain in front of the city, as beautiful and with as much water as that of Ardoch. Spread out on this plain were only villages populated by Armenians, all the way to the Euphrates River. There were also large Syrian villages, Avios, Abduher, and others. There were 3 famous monasteries on the plain, Sosrig, Surp Kavork, Surp Abdul Maseh, and Karmirvank. The monastery of Surp Abdul Maseh is located at the foot of a mountain, and the blood-covered stone upon which the father sacrificed his son is still there. Wise Vartabeds and copyists live in Garmirvank, as noted by historians. To this day, good books and learned Vartabeds are produced here. The abbot of the monastery of Surp Kavork was Vartabed Mukardich, a student of Catholicos Azaria, with whom I was acquainted. Seeing me, he took me in. Then he goes on to tell some very interesting stories or traditions, kind of folk beliefs about kind of folk religious beliefs about things here. And that kind of information is also really interesting in this travel account, if you're interested in that sort of thing. And then he goes on to say, to talk about this other village, we can skip that part. In Harput, there were also large houses, as in Sebastia. We saw one house that measured 40 beds. The household all obeyed the father. If the father died, they obeyed the oldest brother. This is the kind of love and unity we witnessed in that land. Meanwhile, in other places, even brothers and sisters cannot live peacefully together in one house. The Armenians and Syrians were friendly to each other. They gave and took girls in marriage. If an Armenian died, they called a Syrian Yedets, priest, to the funeral, and if a Syrian died, an Armenian Kahana, priest. They all spoke Armenian. And it's very common for Armenians and Syrians to intermarry like this. Some of you, I'm sure, probably have, a Syrian, Syriac, grandfather, great-grandfather, or grandmother, like in your family tree, because of this kind of close-knit ties between the communities. There were also Greek villages, the inhabitants of which also gave their own and took Armenian girls in marriage. They were very friendly, united with the Armenians, and spoke Armenian. Thus you could not know who was an Armenian, who a Greek, and who a Syrian, for you could not distinguish between them. So very interesting about the lives of the different communities there. And so from Harput, he goes on, and he arrives at his longed-for destination of Mush to visit St. Garabed Church. As I mentioned, it was the #1 pilgrimage site in Western Armenia. So we started out this series reading about Agathongelos, who wrote about St. Gregory. And according to the story and later traditions, this is where Agathongelos or St. Gregory built, I think, the first church. And there he had with him relics of St. John the Baptist and this other figure called Atanagenes. And he deposited the relics there and built a church. And this, very large structure was built many years later, but in the same place. And Saint Garabed was just one of the most revered figures in Armenian tradition, and so this place was just a major destination. So the reason the picture's in black and white is, as you might guess, because it was completely destroyed in the genocide, and there's essentially no surviving place here. And this is what it would have looked like to enter in. So this is the great cathedral church with the arches that Simeon's going to talk about in just a minute. And inside, this is the best picture you can find, despite how blurry it is. This is like the tomb of John the Baptist where they kept the relics. So let's listen to Simeon's reaction to seeing this place. So he says, seeing the domes of Surp Garabed, we fell to the ground and filled with great joy, thanked God who enabled us to see Surp Garabed. Glory be to God. This was a large and magnificent stone vaulted church with 2 domes. Its roof, like that of a mosque, was covered with lead. Entering inside, we saw a large fenced yard with many cells and rooms. There was a special and blessed Vartabet called vols, 4 bishops, 15 aberas, monks, essentially, stewards, and deacons. All the workers were Kurds who spoke fluent Armenian. Not only in the monastery, but throughout the plain and province of Mush, the Kurds speak Armenian and swear by Surp Garabed. We brought a small gift, handed it to the priests after the Mass, and asked them to take us to where the tomb was. There were beautiful marble columns in the church. On the right side, there was the chapel and the tomb of Surp Garabed, and on the other side, the tomb of Bishop Atanagen. We bowed to them and asked for the forgiveness of our sins, those of our parents and our benefactors. I had attained the fulfillment of my wish. May God enable all to attain their wishes. They gave us precious soil taken from the holy tomb so that he could take back with him. The Vartabed invited us to dinner. He was a God-fearing and God-loving man who spoke pleasantly and absorbingly. We ate the monastery meal and drank the water, and it goes on. And so you can read these kind of great descriptions of his reaction, both descriptive and his personal reaction of how it affected him to visiting places like this, or he has a great description of his time in Venice, visiting St. Mark's, the just amazing church there. And yeah, if you're interested, I'd highly recommend this text. So these two texts from the 17th century give a taste of the kind of fascinating material that makes up the written legacy of early modern Armenians. There is much, much more to explore and enjoy in this time period. And I didn't want, by stopping with Tovma of Medzop, to leave the impression that the Armenian historical tradition dies or is brought to an inglorious end in the 15th century. Rather, it's much better to think of it as a continuum and a somewhat seamless transition into the early modern period, despite the many changes brought about to Armenian life as a result of the transformations in the human experience taking place across the globe at this time. In many ways, thanks to the interconnectivity brought about by the diaspora merchant networks and colonies across the world, Armenians kept pace with all the latest technological developments of the period. For example, they were among the first Near Eastern peoples to adopt the technology of the printing press. And in many ways, cultural production was superior in this time to previous eras, thanks to the sponsorship of the wealthy merchants of New Julfa and the wealthy Amira business class of Constantinopolitan Armenians, who stepped in to fill the gap left by the Nakharar noble class. I've attempted to demonstrate throughout this series how the Armenian historical tradition, despite the idiosyncrasies and particularities and delightful uniqueness of each author and text, can profitably be considered a single tradition. Well, the unity of this tradition is nowhere better seen than in the 3-volume History of Armenia, produced by the great Makhitara scholar and Vartabed, Mikayel Chamchean. I mentioned this book at the beginning of this series, and it's with this book also that we'll close this lecture series. We should note, too, that the publication of many Makhitaris books were sponsored by wealthy Julfan merchants, such as the Shahriman brothers, who were eager not just for the spiritual and theological works that were the focus of Abbot Makhitar's publication efforts, but also for works of history and geography, as Sebu Aswanian has shown in some of his studies, looking at kind of reader response to Makhitaris publications. So Chamchean responded to this need by producing a massive 3-volume History of Armenia, published between 1774 to 76, and subtitled From the Beginning of the World to the Year of Our Lord, 1784. And in this work, Chamchean pulls together all of the historical works that we've examined in this series, plus many more, synthesizing them into one unified account of Armenian history that spans over 2,000 pages. Likewise, it's thanks to the Makhitaris, as well as the sponsorship and patronage of Julfan merchants and Constantinopolitan Amira businessmen, that the first works of the Armenian historians were published and widely distributed. And here's just one example. This is the first edition of Agathangelos's history, published in 1709. And this copy we actually have here at the Zohrab Center. It's a picture. Armenian publishing has rarely, if ever, been a profitable venture. And so we owe our thanks to the generous sponsorship and patronage of dedicated individuals who saw the value of producing, publishing, and transmitting these works. Thanks to them, the Armenian historical tradition has now made its way into our hands, and it's up to us to reclaim, read, and revivify these great works, which in the words of Moses Khorenatsi, have been left as an immortal memorial for you and the generations to come. Thank you.